This is the Education Gadfly Show.
Welcome to the Education Gadfly Show. I'm your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute. Today, we're joined by Barbara Biasi, assistant professor at Yale School of Management, to discuss Wisconsin's Act 10 and the implications of a recent court ruling declaring it unconstitutional. Later on the Research Minute, Amber shares a study examining the underrepresentation of certain racial and socioeconomic groups in gifted education. All this and more on the Education Gadfly Show.
What does Gadfly say?
Hello, this is your host, Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, here at the Education Gadfly Show and online at fordhaminstitute.org. And now, please join me in welcoming our special guest for this week, Barbara Biasi. Barbara, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thanks a lot for the invitation to join.
Yeah, Barbara is an assistant professor at the Yale School of Management and author of an Education Next article from last year titled Wisconsin's Act 10, Flexible Pay and the Impact on Teacher Labor Markets. We're going to talk about all of that, but first, my co-host David Griffith, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, well, we wanted to have Barbara come on the show because Act 10 has been in the news again. And that is because there's a lawsuit going on there, and a state judge found recently that the act violates the state constitution. And so that is now expected to be heading to the state Supreme Court. This, on top of seeing Barbara's great article this past fall, made me think we should go deeper on this. So let's do that on Ed Reform Update. Okay, Barbara, well, tell us, first of all, can you help our listeners remember Act 10? There was a huge controversy about this when it was first enacted back in the day, but many of our listeners may have forgotten about that. So just give us a quick refresher on that act and what it did and what it meant in terms of teacher union contracts and teacher compensation.
Yeah, so Act 10 was really the landmark piece of legislation of Scott Walker, who had been elected as governor in 2010. The act was among the first things he did once he got into power in March of 2011. And it was really a piece of legislation aimed at cutting public spending. The state had a projected budget deficit of about $3.6 billion. At the time. And so the act was intended to cut public spending through a series of changes in rules regulating public sector employment. And one of the main things that this big reform did was really changing the rules of the game for collective bargaining of a subset, and this is going to be crucial for the recent lawsuit, a subset of public sector employees. I became interested in this because this subset included, for the most part, public school teachers, who are, one of the main things I'm interested in from a research perspective. And so what really this reform implied for them was dramatic changes in the rules that public sector teacher unions have to abide to in order to operate. And in particular, after Act 10, unions have to recertify every year, obtaining a majority of all members of the bargaining unit plus one, which is a pretty difficult endeavor to achieve every year. It's not easy for unions to recertify every year. And in fact, in immediate aftermath of the reform, a lot of unions failed to recertify for a variety of reasons. In addition, the act prohibited the automatic collection of union dues from employees' paychecks, which means that now if people, including teachers, want to contribute to the union, they have to actively say so. It's not the default anymore. And maybe unsurprisingly, this led to a dramatic decline in the membership revenues of public sector unions. And then this is somewhat more specific to teachers, but the reform also changed what unions can bargain on. And in particular, in the case of teachers, unions cannot bargain over a teacher's salary schedule, which is essentially a big table that used to determine prior to the reform how much teachers with a certain level of experience or academic credentials would earn, which implies that school districts now have much more flexibility in terms of setting teacher pay however they want to. And this dimension in particular was the focus of a lot of the work that I've been doing, because it was something that was very, very new in the public education spectrum. So I looked at the implications for the labor market for public school teachers as well as for students.
Yeah, and this was what was interesting when you read the article and are reminded there's not a lot of research on innovative models of teacher compensation because there haven't been that many innovative models of teacher compensation, right? Almost everywhere, it's the single salary schedule, which is required by law, or in many cases, it's just what the unions want, and they have a lot of power over those sorts of things. So, okay, so we have a natural experiment here in Wisconsin then to see what happens if school districts try a different approach to teacher compensation and how that plays out. So, yeah, tell us about that.
So the first thing to notice about the setting after the reform is that in terms of how the reform could be implemented, a crucial detail is that the collective bargaining agreements that school districts had entered and signed prior to the signing of Act 10 remained valid until their expiration. And this, for an applied economist, is very nice because it gives you differences in when the reform kicks in across various districts, which basically can be sort of ascribed to a quasi-experiment that is very helpful to identify the causal effect of a reform on a series of outcomes. And so I did that. And I combined the sort of variation with what I observed districts actually doing in the aftermath of the reform. And in particular, something that I observed by looking at the employee handbooks, which are these documents that became really popular after Act 10 among school districts to sort of explain how the districts were going to pay teachers. They're typically large PDFs that districts would put on their websites. I used those to basically tell whether districts were getting closer to what I call flexible pay, which is maybe also, paying teachers based on how hard they work or how well they do with their students or in the classroom, or whether school districts, even in the absence of collective bargaining over salary schedules, were just continuing to pay teachers largely based on experience and education. And I basically looked at what happened to movements of teachers both across districts between the two groups, the districts that stayed with seniority pay and the districts that moved to flexible pay, and out of the profession when the reform was implemented in each school district. And I tried to look at the behavior of different types of teachers based on demographics like seniority and education, but also a measure of their teaching quality. And to do that, I basically used student test scores and calculated value added, which is a very controversial measure of teacher quality, but it's also, I would say, one of the very few that we have available as researchers. And something that I found, which I thought was quite remarkable, is that even though in Wisconsin, certainly back in the day, but still to a large extent today, school districts do not use value added for anything, at least explicitly. I did find that pay was completely uncorrelated with teacher value added prior to the reform, as we would expect, but actually became correlated with value added after the reform, even though school districts don't have this measure at their disposal. And my interpretation of that finding is that school districts are probably using the flexibility to pay teachers for something that is not value added, but it's somewhat correlated with it. Can be a measure of how hard they work, how well they teach, how much students like them or parents like them, and things like that.
So let's pause just for a moment. There's so much to take in. And by the way, I mean, incredible work here. And I mean, you are just, I think, David, you're singing his tune on all the methods, but wow, this was a lot of work and incredible. But that there's good news here. I mean, I wouldn't have necessarily thought that you would see any school district actually do things any differently, right? I mean, we've never really known is if you take away these restrictions, would school districts, or, look, they're bureaucracies and they're run by elected school board members. And, you might guess that they would just keep doing the same old thing. So the fact that there are at least some districts out there trying something else is great. And then the fact that, even if they don't know it, they seem to be doing a good job paying more for the higher performing teachers. So this is all of this we're celebrating. I say that in part because I know we're going to get to some bad news coming up here as well.
Yeah. So just to echo what you just said, I was also in part surprised, and I wanted to understand a little bit more about what district leaders were thinking. So at some point, I actually called a handful of them on the phone. I asked to speak with them, and I asked them, what the reaction to Act 10 was, how they were thinking about this, using this flexibility, whether they were aware of it, whether they were concerned about it. And much to my surprise, the overwhelming response seemed to be that school districts were aware of the flexibility, and they were aware of the potential opportunity that this flexibility was opening up for them. Although some of them did voice concerns having to do with essentially how you set up a teacher compensation scheme when you don't have a salary schedule, which might be complicated, especially for somewhat smaller school districts that don't have a lot of, manpower in terms of management. But also concerns with teacher morale, because the reform was really controversial and was really perceived by teachers as an attack to the profession. So a lot of school districts leaders did mention this as a reason for actually not changing their pay scheme at all.
Yeah. No,
now you mentioned some of the bad news about Act 10. So one result, which I think is important to highlight, and I didn't really wrap up too much the implications of the previous finding, but basically what I find overall is that this relationship that arises between teacher quality and pay after Act 10 actually improves the composition of the teaching workforce by essentially driving low value added teachers out of public schools.
So that's good. That's more good news.
This is a good thing.
Right.
This is a good thing. But then we did a little bit more work trying to understand whether all teachers gained in the same way, with a particular focus on differences along gender lines. And the reason why we did that is that a setting where pay is more flexibly set is a setting that essentially opens up the scope for individual level bargaining. And we know from research in economics as well as in other social sciences that men and women don't have the same propensity to bargain. They just don't behave in the same way in contexts where bargaining is a possibility, especially bargaining over pay. And what we find is very much in line with this. Namely, we find that if we just calculate the gender pay gap for public school teachers in Wisconsin, namely just the difference between observationally identical men and women who have the same years of experience, same education, teaching exactly in the same school district, and even in some of the tests that we did, having the same value added, we see no differences prior to the reform, as we should expect, because essentially seniority and education are the only things that determine pay. But then after the reform, men end up earning more and women end up earning less. And so we tried then to understand whether this gender pay gap that we saw sort of showing up in the data post-reform was really driven by differences in bargaining behavior. So we did a survey. We reached out to the teachers via email. We got a surprisingly high response rate of about 15%, which might sound low, but it's actually pretty high because we didn't pay teachers. We just, sent them random emails asking them to fill in a Qualtrics survey. But a lot of them wanted to talk actually about their experience. So that was interesting. And what we basically asked them, have you ever bargained with your employer over a range of items, not just pay? Do you foresee doing so in the future? If you didn't bargain, why didn't you do that? And if you did so, did you think that the process was successful from your standpoint? And we saw huge differences between men and women, namely women bargain at a much lower rate. And among the reasons given was that women tend to not feel comfortable in situations where they have to bargain. The interesting thing is that while the bargaining over pay is a new thing that sort of arose in Wisconsin after Act 10, people were bargaining over other aspects of the job prior to Act 10. For example, classroom assignment or non-teaching duties and other kind of aspects of the job. And along those margins, we see no differences across gender. So it's really the bargaining over pay, the point where we see the big differences. And so the reform overall ended up not benefiting everybody in the same way, but rather gave rise to a gender pay gap.
Wow, it's also fascinating. And again, we said there's not been a lot of teacher compensation innovation, but the ones that I'm familiar with, the programs are things like DC Impact or the reforms in Dallas, now in Houston, which tend to be still very rule driven, right? There's a system, it's all linked to some kind of evaluation or maybe serving in certain kinds of schools. But it's not like they're giving principals the flexibility to just say, hey, you can do some bargaining with teachers and figure out how much they're worth. But in this case, there was that opening. The other place I wonder is, of course, in private schools and in charter schools, I wonder if we could get under the hood there, if we would see some gender divides. David, I'm sure you are brimming with questions and comments. I mean, it looks like Barbara did like 10 studies in one here. It's incredible. But what's on your mind?
Yeah, well, first of all, I'll just say, it's a spectacular study. So congratulations. It's fascinating. Actually, you touched on one of my first questions, which is just has to do with charter schools and vouchers and understanding, does either the original legislation or the most recent court case, does it apply to these? Are they considered public schools? Is everyone operating under the same rules or not?
So there's two types of charter schools in Wisconsin, those that sort of belong to a school districts and those that are independent. The independent ones are not covered by this reform. Teachers in those charter schools, my understanding is they tend to not necessarily be unionized. This was true also before the reform, whereas the other set of charter schools were also subject to the reform. My studies have primarily focused on teachers in standard public schools, just to avoid or to keeping things a little bit cleaner. But I agree would be interesting, first of all, to look at charter school teachers more specifically, but also to look at whether the effects may be different in markets where there's a stronger charter school presence, like Milwaukee, for example.
Yeah, I guess that's great. And I guess another question I have, which I just can't help but ask, even though it's kind of outside the scope of K-12, is I've obviously heard of this finding about women and bargaining before. And so, it's sort of demoralizing to see it show up again. But that's so fascinating, that bit about it not holding for non-salary, things, right? So I guess I'm just curious to know what your interpretation of that is. It's sort of, there's like a glimmer of hope there, right? Which is that maybe it's just cultural or something that, it's obviously cultural at some level, right? But essentially, maybe they're just not used to bargaining for salary, right? And maybe there'll be change over time. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or is there research that shows what would make it more likely or what would change behavior?
I think there's other studies that have found that women tend to be particularly uncomfortable in asking something related to pay. I think in part the result can be explained by culture in the sense that bargaining over classroom assignment is probably something that everybody does and it's accepted and people expect to be doing that, which is why you don't see any differences between men and women, whereas bargaining over pay is something that was, if anything, possibly even frowned upon in the pre-reform regime because it's not a thing and not a thing that can be accommodated within the set of laws that were in place prior to the reform. And so maybe there's different attitudes towards doing something that was previously not possible between men and women. Although I should say that here the men that we're looking at are men who are public school teachers. So if anything, they should, given the sort of overall demographics of the K-12 public school teacher population, if anything, we should expect them to behave more like women if the culture is sort of built within the profession than your average male worker. So the result, I think, is even more striking.
Right. No, and I think about how some people listening and watching probably think about the history of pay in American schools. That my understanding is that the idea of giving teachers extra pay for master's degrees was because it was mostly secondary teachers who had master's degrees, and they were mostly men. And so that was a way of paying male teachers more than female teachers. We have been struggling with this issue for a long time. And it's a fascinating one. And again, I don't want to lose the sight of all the other findings too, which, some are super encouraging. This particular one on gender, more discouraging. So much to dig into. Barbara Biasi at the Yale School of Management. Barbara, thank you for this incredible work, and thank you for coming on the show.
Of course. Thanks a lot for having me.
All right. Now it's time for everyone's favorite, Amber's Research Minute. Amber, welcome back to the show.
Thanks, Mike.
And congratulations to your Washington Commanders.
Oh my gosh, they're going to give me a heart attack, Mike. I mean, how many more games can we wait till like the last 3 to 5 seconds? And then it doinks off the field goal. I mean, oh my gosh, it was nuts.
Amazing. I mean, this must be the first playoff game victory
since 2005, I think.
Wow. It's incredible. I will say I woke up very confused and surprised this morning because I swore that they were way behind. And I said to my son, Nico, I was like, God, I turned off that game too early. I thought they were. He said, Dad, you were watching the game from the first week of the season, the Commanders Buccaneers game.
Are you serious?
What? I remember I turned on Hulu, and it was right there, Commanders versus Buccaneers. I thought, that's weird. I thought it was tonight instead of during the day, but I was like, oh, okay. So I put it on. And I was like, oh, bummer. I kind of wasn't paying attention. Anyway.
Wow. Well, I hope you saw the highlights of the real game, because
I need to see the highlights. More importantly, I need to convince him not to check me in to a memory care facility right now because he is threatening to do so.
Oh man, funny stuff. But they won in the game I watched, Mike, and that's all that matters.
All right. Well, Amber, this is kind of a research minute too for this week, since we just had a deep dive into a fantastic piece of research by Barbara Biasi at Yale about Wisconsin's Act 10 and teacher compensation, innovation.
Very good.
So I don't know, it's going to be hard to beat that one, but tell us what you got.
All right, we got a new study out. It examines a simple but important question, and it's the degree to which disproportionate representation in gifted education can be explained by test score differences across racial and economic groups, or is it unbiased or biased rules? Scott Peters and Jonathan Plucker, among a couple other scholars, dig into data from one large district in the U.S. It's a diverse district in size, race, and ethnic composition, so the study is not representative. But on a positive note, I've also heard from the authors that they're soon to release another study with some more districts that basically show the very similar findings as from this one district. They use data from 25,000 second grade kids, demographic breakdown of roughly 40% white, 30% Latino, 20% Asian, and 10% Black. They've got a bunch of test score data, including iReady, math and reading scores, a nonverbal abilities test, the Naglieri. I think some folks may be familiar with that. The COG-AT, which measures cognitive abilities, as well as teacher ratings of gifted behaviors, in which all teachers are asked to rate all students on behaviors like problem solving, ability, and curiosity. The district's definition of giftedness focuses on general intellectual ability. So they're mainly looking at test scores, although they can also get referrals from staff, parents, and students. They have a profile with all of this data, and then it goes to a diverse district committee, all of whom are trained on what holistic consideration means. And then they holistically consider each student in the screen pool for placement into advanced education programming. Because both screening and eligibility could be a source of bias, they look at both the screening and eligibility results. They use multi-level logistic regression to run 5 primary models that basically range from no controls to fully loaded. First, they do a bunch of descriptive statistics, and they show that there are large differences between the percent of each demographic group screened and found eligible. But unsurprisingly, there were large differences in mean test scores across the groups. For instance, the Asian kids scored roughly 1 standard deviation higher on the COG AT than the Hispanic kids did. And then finally, when they look at all of the results and the models, the completely uncontrolled model shows that Black and white students were 41% and 48% as likely as their Asian American peers to be screened, while the FRL eligible kids were 25% as likely to be screened as their non-FRL eligible peers. But when they use the full control model, that includes all the data from all those assessments I already mentioned, the nonverbal ability test, the cognitive ability, the math and reading scores, the teacher ratings of gifted behavior, they throw all of that in. And the Black students, Hispanic students, and students from low-income backgrounds are 1.3 to 5.4 times more likely to be identified for gifted services than their similarly scoring Asian American or higher income peers, despite the fact that they're still underrepresented in the gifted population. And then a couple other quick findings compared to their Asian peers only. White students were the racial group least likely to be screened, and similar patterns occurred when they looked at eligibility. So in the fully controlled model, Black students, for instance, were more likely than their similarly scoring Asian peers to be found eligible for services. The results for Hispanic and FRL kids were a little bit more complicated. But anyway, analysts conclude by saying that this doesn't imply that racism or bias doesn't exist, but it also suggests that lack of opportunity is the bigger issue, since when Black and Hispanic kids score at higher levels, they do tend to be screened and found eligible for services. That's what I've got.
Okay, that is good work indeed. Look, those of us at Fordham have been obsessed with this question of how to make sure we have a bigger, broader pipeline of advanced kids, that starts like this study looks at in the early grades, and ideally doing universal screening, right? I mean, that's right. The way to solve some of this is rather than try to make this decision about who to screen everybody and see what comes out. But, let's be honest, the results are not going to be proportional across these various groups. To some, and look, I think this is where it's just one of the toughest issues in education in our society. Should we try to level the playing field in various ways? We know that kids coming from poverty who are disproportionately Black or Hispanic, don't have the same opportunities as many of their peers. Maybe they haven't yet had the chance, for example, to fully develop their vocabulary, kind of the Edie Hirsch view of the world, where they haven't been exposed yet to, the content knowledge that maybe some of the wealthier kids have. And once that happens, they're going to catch right up and they're going to demonstrate that they can achieve it at super high levels also. But, by second grade, they're not there yet. So, how do you feel about the sort of, 5 times as likely to be identified feels like a lot? I'd be comfortable with something above, complete parity, like, okay, we're only going to look at test scores and we're going to ignore everything else, especially for little kids. Maybe it's different at college. I don't know, David, where do you come down on all this?
I'm not sure it matters where I come down. I'm wondering, is this the basis for the next lawsuit? Aren't we basically just saying that if you're Asian and you score highly, you're at a huge disadvantage? I'm not taking a normative stance on this, but it feels really familiar to me. Except this time we're talking about smaller kids instead of bigger kids. And it still feels like there's absolutely, just like it's a zero-sum game, honestly. Like you can't have one without the other.
Yeah.
Maybe there's some halfway house with FRL status that people will find more palatable.
Right.
But I don't know. I mean, the fact that it's based on such transparent data that you could do the study the way they did it, it just makes me think that I don't know if it's going to be politically tenable. If this gets replicated places and people start paying attention to it in this particular way.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point, David. I think you're right. I mean, I think you would have to certainly doing it by race would be
Right.
under strict scrutiny. I think if you did it by class, that might be but some of the conservatives are arguing to the courts that even if you're doing it by class, but you're still really trying to do it by race, that's a problem. Do you do top 10% kind of plans? Fordham with our National Working Group on Advanced Education a year ago, that was our big proposal, is make sure that at least 10% of every elementary school's kids are doing a gifted and talented program. Can go above that if there's more kids who are well qualified, right? And so maybe that's the way. You say, at this high poverty school, it's at least 10%, and they're mostly Black or Hispanic kids who wouldn't necessarily qualify if you had a district-wide standard. At another school that's mostly white and Asian, it's 40% of the kids. You're not actually limiting the opportunity. And that's, both good educationally and maybe constitutionally as well.
Well, and just to be clear, it's not like the explicit goal is to create some sort of racially diverse gifted class here, right? It's just that it seems to operate in practice in a way that is similar to some of these other practices, right?
Well, something's going on. I mean, they made a decision.
Something's going on. I agree, but it's not as though, though that's like sort of explicitly articulated anywhere. I don't think.
I don't know.
Maybe I'm wrong.
I don't know. Amber?
I mean, they did make the decision to use the Asian students as the reference group, and they said in there, they made that explicitly because, they could have done, they could have made the white kids the reference group, or the kids of color versus the non-kids of color. But anyway, they didn't want it to be Eurocentric or something like that. So that's why they kind of came down the side of having the Asian kids be the reference group.
Well, universal screening, and everybody who's ready to succeed in advanced education should get the chance to do advanced education. And I think if you do that and say up at least 10%, so you capture in some of these schools more kids of color, this stuff's hard. This stuff is hard, but really, really good work from Jonathan and Scott and their colleagues. So thank you for bringing it to us, Amber.
Indeed.
All right. Well, that is all the time we've got for this week. So until next week.
I'm David Griffith.
And I'm Mike Petrilli of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, signing off.
The Education Gadfly Show is a production of the Thomas B. Fordham Institute, located in Washington, D.C. For more information, visit us online at fordhaminstitute.org.